All right, we are back with discussions or conversations on the formula of Concord, and we have thus far went through the history. We have gone briefly over the controversies, and now we are going to do the introduction and see if we get into the first article, which is original sin. So, Scott, what is contained in this introduction to the epitome?
Basically what you're getting here, and this will serve for the solid declaration too. What you're getting here is the acknowledgement, and we said this yesterday, so it's important to, or whenever it was, it's important to sort of touch back to this. This is written for churches that are claiming to be churches of the Augsburg Confession. An easy way to say that is just to say this is written for churches and people that claim to be Lutheran. And it right off the bat acknowledges that there are pastors and churches of the Augsburg Confession, again Lutheran, that are teaching things that are not in line with the teachings of the Augsburg Confession. Historically, Lutherans since 1530, it's why we started there when we did the original introductions, since 1530 when the Augsburg Confession were written, were known as the Church of the Augsburg Confession. Anytime Lutherans would reach out to other magisteriums to try to get them to buy into the Lutheran Reformation, they would attempt to sell them on not all of Luther's works, not all of Melanchthon's works, but they'd attempt to sell them on the Augsburg Confession and get them to subscribe to the Augsburg Confession. And so this, right off the bat, is all it's acknowledging is that there are churches of the Augsburg, boasting to be part of the Church of the Augsburg Confession, who are teaching things which are not in accord with the Augustana itself. The reason for that is because of the controversies that we spent a couple of recordings on. The controversies are not all directly addressed by the Augustana, and so while the formulators would say, yeah, but you're still teaching stuff that pretty much was covered in the Augustana, they're saying, yeah, but not specifically. And so what you see in the formula is more specificity on this stuff.
What's interesting to me about the introduction too, or what's maybe helpful for people if you're just sort of familiarizing yourself with this writing, is you really do see the appeal to the various authorities that are used in order to establish the doctrinal statements that will be made going forward. So it starts off with, of course, the Word of God being the foundation. But then, from that, these various confessions and documents that they believe espouse the proper teaching of the Word of God. Right. And so everything going forward is going to be sort of the attempt is to align our doctrine with these things.
Yeah. There's an interesting note here in the list that I'm reading from. It's like Eric said, prophetic and apostolic writings, the Old New Testament, the three creeds. So for the that's gonna be the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. Mm-hmm. By this time, they're referring to the unaltered Augsburg Confession,
right?
Because Melanchthon, in pretty much right after he wrote the unaltered Augsburg Confession, started writing changes to the Augsburg Confession that he kept the title, and they began to be referred to as the Variata and sometimes the Invariata. But the churches that were Lutheran eventually said, yeah, we're not really interested in that 1541 version of the Augsburg Confession that John Calvin signed on to. We're interested in the 1531 that was presented to the emperor. And so you'll see that a lot. The unaltered Augsburg Confession, the Apology, which is just the defense of the Augsburg Confession, written a year later in response to the Pontifical Confutation, which was written against the Augsburg Confession. Small called articles, we referred to that in previous video. If you want an easy way to think of that, it's Luther's last theological will and testament. It's, besides the catechisms, the only confession of his authorship in the Book of Concord, besides the large and small catechism. And then the other ones are referred to there, Luther's small and large catechism. Interesting deletion from this list is Melanchthon's articles on the power and primacy of the Pope, which of course do make it into the 1580 Book of Concord, and which of course, when they were written at the same time as Luther's small call articles, were adopted when Luther's small call articles were not. So interesting.
Is there a reason for that? Is part of that Melanchthon, that people were iffy on Melanchthon because of the altered Augsburg Confession, and some of the
I think
factions?
so. I think so. Of course, it makes it into the 1580 Book of Concord because it was already accepted by the
Mhm.
Church of the Augsburg Confession as a confessional document of the time. The Diet, where the power and primacy of the Pope was accepted, Luther was supposed to attend, and he was sick, and so he did not. Melanchthon did attend, and Melanchthon lobbied for the acceptance of the power and primacy of the Pope, and it made it.
Historically, what's interesting, I mean, by this time, that the formula is coming out too, you have, two very, it's not just two factions, but, you have one group called the Philippists, derogatively, and you have one group called the Gnesian Luther, the genuine, authentic Lutherans. So, I mean, the lines drawn and connected with Philip Melanchthon by this time are pretty sharp,
Yeah.
fairly or unfairly,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah. I mean, I worked for a lot of years with Melanchthon's works, and I'd say to some degree it's fair. You have to be critical of him, but he can't be written off. And so and I think that of every character of this, you have to be critical of Luther. I mean,
Sure.
Luther writes some crazy stuff. He writes some great stuff, but he writes some crazy stuff too. And you have to sort of be aware of that when you get into reading Luther. Same thing's true with Melanchthon. Melanchthon, by just page count, authored most of the Book of Concord.
Yeah.
If you strictly on page count. So
these, yeah, go ahead, Dan.
No, so this is true. I mean, this is true of like basically every theological hero.
Yeah.
I mean, every theological hero that puts pen to paper as often as people who end up theological heroes do, and whose lives are as studied as they end up being. It turns out that they're imperfect and they're sinners and all of this stuff, right? I mean,
turns out they're just people.
Yeah, I mean, nobody can survive the scrutiny
Yeah.
of that we would put someone like that under. And so I mean, Calvin's the same way. There's Calvin that does all of this stuff that theologically is just he's just a beast. But there's things that he did also that you're like, ooh, I don't know about that, man.
Well,
so
theologically, I mean, when it comes down to it, there's the distinction that's made is basically like when it comes to a theologian's individual works, you're going to chew the meat and spit out some bones. When it comes to confessions, that's not the case. We're saying we can accept this confession as it's written and say hooray and affirm it. Not so with individual theologians. You're chewing meat and spitting out bones.
That's right. That's a good way to say it.
Yeah. Another thing I think is interesting about this introduction, Scott, is that it really does sort of start with sola scriptura, right? So,
absolutely.
I mean, that is the first thing they mention.
Yeah, I mean, and that was a critical breaking point for a confessional standard, starting with the Augsburg Confession. That we're going to base everything we teach, confess on the scriptures alone. Now, in the Augsburg Confession, you see it here too, but I'll say very particularly in the Augsburg Confession, you see a connection to church fathers that Melanchthon is intentionally making in an attempt to make the argument that what he writes in the Augsburg Confession is what has been handed down as a unity of doctrine in the church for ages.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that it starts with sola scriptura, but you can tell they're not biblicist because starts with sola scriptura, but then goes on to the teachings of the containing the creeds and then the church fathers and so on and so forth. So the sort of modern idea of sola scriptura, which is like all you need is the Bible and just forget everything else. That's obviously not what they mean by it. They start there where they say, look, we want to back all this up with scripture, which you'll see that there's a ton of scripture in it, but they don't do that in exclusion to the church fathers or the creeds or the councils or any of that.
Correct. Yeah. It's also not anti-rational. So what you'll see here is a rather appropriate use of rational thinking and philosophy, but in this sense, when we normally say it as a handmaid to the theology. In other words, it's using our God-given intellect and our ability to work through things rationally to understand the scriptures, not to tell the scriptures what they ought to say.
Right. That's a good distinction.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so do we want to jump into the first article?
I'm good if you are.
All right.
I think we can.
Let's give it a shot. So the first article is on original sin. So what is the controversy stated for original sin here? What's the crux of it?
Well, in the formula, you'll always get the at the beginning, the formulators will say the one side contends and then the other side teaches, and that's a very, you'll see that theme over and over again. So one side, that man's nature is wholly corrupted as a result of the fall. That ever since the fall, the nature and the substance and the essence of the fallen man is in itself original sin, is subject to original sin. Now, this is, of course, the teaching of Flacius, as we sort of noted in a previous video. Again, right off the bat, one of the reasons I said you don't lose, it's not anti-rational or anti-philosophical, is because you already are seeing philosophical, specifically Aristotelian language coming in here. Anytime you hear things like substance, essence, and accidents, think Aristotle, because he's the one who gave us this, as he's sort of demarking the parts of various things, even arguments. He's demarking the parts of various arguments. He uses this type of stuff too.
And so you see these distinctions come up in arguments over the Lord's Supper as well.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's interesting, though, at the end of this article, not to skip ahead too much, but they actually instruct pastors like, hey, don't use the language of substance and accidents for the regular people in your pews, because they don't know what the heck you're talking about. So they actually warn against, like, hey, don't get all intellectual, but you can keep on using that language in the academy. Fine.
Yeah. And they're kind of saying too, you guys don't really understand. Most of you don't really understand it either. So just trust us on this one.
Right.
Let's just say, and by trust us, I mean, let's just, one of the things when Lutherans are on their game, they speak as the scriptures speak. And so even if the scriptures make it sound like a whole corruption, which is a good way of describing original sin, but just use scriptural language rather than going to Aristotle on this. That can be helpful, but it can, if it's not kept in under some discipline, it can be very harmful too, as we see here.
Well, so one of the issues with with the wholly corrupt, you could take that to mean that, or like as a reformer would say, that they would call this like total depravity, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
and it could lead you to and we'd be okay with that.
Yeah,
but what we don't want to do is make it seem as if everything is as corrupt and depraved as it possibly could be.
Yeah, it's not that we're all walking around as sociopaths. It mostly describes our relationship with God, and God to us and us to God. It has impact on our relationship with other people, in that too they hold the image of God, and that when we act in a selfish manner in which we tend to act, that we are sinning against them, and in sinning against them we're sinning against God. But I do like, though, that in the next one, so you have the one side, the bad side, right? The other side, here's the proper side, is teaching that sin is not part of the substance or essence, that this is a corruption. And that's the word that's used here, or the phrase that's used, is that it's a deep corruption. If you go just a little bit further, you'll see that what they're trying to distinguish here is a difference between God's work, he creates and he says this is good, and the devil's work. He corrupts God's creation. He looks at it and says, this is what I wanted, a corrupted good thing.
That's actually, there's some Augustinian overtones to that, which Augustine would talk in the same sort of way and use similar type language. But you'll see as you go through this article, that word corruption is used many times. It's obviously very purposefully placed. They chose that word to emphasize what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, they're making this distinction between it being part of your substance, which would have to be part of what God intended in the first place, and and something that has is not God's intention, but a corruption of God's intent and command.
Yeah, and it's a thorough corruption in the sense that there's nothing that we do that is untouched by it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just merely that I have some sin on me that I find hard to get rid of, but that this corruption runs deep, and it runs so deep that even my good works are touched by it. All of this doesn't mean that I've never done something nice for someone ever, or that I'm as evil as I possibly could be, but that even the good that the perceived good that I do is still marred and corrupted, it's still touched by sin. It's
Yeah.
tainted everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And so gets into the difference when you do this with, and you guys know this, like if you're teaching catechism class, you'll describe this in terms of difference between sin and sins, right?
Right.
This is not just the fact that you sin, that you do bad stuff. This is the fact that you are a sinner, that the sin
Yes.
is you're born with it, right? It's
Yeah.
like a disease handed down from father to son,
Mm-hmm.
which is, a really good illustration of how this kind of works.
Yeah,
know?
which most of the time with catechism students, when you actually teach them this is for a lot of them the first time they've ever thought about it in that way.
Right.
They
Yeah.
tend to think of sin as only like, I did a bad deed.
Yeah, I didn't do the dishes when mom asked me to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is an important distinction to make, that you sin because you are a sinner.
Yep.
That's why. It's who you are. Yeah.
Yep. And then you get very strong language, which I think our age could use a little bit more of, which is, and what Eric said, that you'll see this word corruption coming again and again. That says, on account of, the Latin phrase there is the same phrase that's used when we say why we're saved. It's propter, Propteer. It's a Latin phrase. It means on account of, because of, for the sake of. And it says on account of this corruption, right? Because of this corruption, for however it's translated in the edition you're using, we are under the wrath of God.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, the interesting thing is, when we described how we're saved, we'll say that we're saved on account of Christ. You'll see that Latin word again, propter. Propter Christum in this sense. You're saved on account of Christ, but on account of the corruption that is your original sin, you're under God's wrath.
Yeah.
Apart from Christ.
Yeah.
You don't always hear that kind of strong language preached in pulpits today. You hear other sort of softer, ways of describing the issue.
Yeah.
But this doesn't mince words at all.
Yeah. I mean, I can say that no one that I know that teaches or writes for 1517 is soft on the law. The problem is they're tired of soft law.
Right.
That's right.
We'd like a little bit more of this type of preaching.
Bring down the hammer of God. Yeah.
You are under God's. If you're apart from Christ, you are under God's wrath.
Yeah. I remember something that as I was first studying through, the Lutheran confessions and this sort of thing that really hammered me. If you really wanted the way that the Lutherans talked about sin, and then this idea of concupiscence, because it's so easy to say, like, well, the sin is the bad thing I do, or maybe that good thing that I should do that I don't do.
Yep.
But then Lutherans come along and they talk about this sort of concupiscence, like the very fact that I don't want to do the good thing, and the very fact that I want to do the bad thing, even though I don't do it, this all speaks to my condemnation.
Yeah.
So concupiscence is sort of that, what's that Latin for, sort of the lower appetite that I have, right? And that in itself is sin. Yeah.
In the Roman Church, it's often connected with like sexually deviant desires, but just properly speaking, it's just your inherent inclination to sin, to want to sin.
And even go ahead.
Oh, go for it, Eric.
Yeah. And even in doing a good thing, we are all too well aware of the fact that there can be all sorts of selfish motivations going on internally that motivate us to do the outwardly good thing.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's the dilemma that we have as sinful human beings.
Yeah, you start wrestling with that idea of original sin, and then you start realizing just how of a bad position you are in.
Yeah.
You start thinking about it like this. You're like, oh my gosh, dude, I am in deep trouble here. Because of course I have these desires, and even I do good things begrudgingly all the time. Like, this is a bad.
I'm doing one now by not going out to a restaurant.
Right, exactly.
But my inclination is to go get a nice French dip sandwich at my favorite restaurant.
Exactly.
In face of the good thing.
I would encourage people to read through not just the positive theses in the article, but also the negative theses, because what happens here, as you read the negative things, they go so far to describe like it really helps you know exactly what they're trying to tell you. So there's a lot of clarifying going on as they get to what they reject.
Yep.
And so that can be helpful, because I think sometimes we hear the positive case and we might not quite understand. Go through the negative theses and you'll get a real clear sense of like exactly what is being said here.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, if you boil it all down, one of the big things like in the rejection of the false opposites dogmas is something that we hear all the time, that people are basically good.
Yeah.
And this article would flat out deny that. They'd be like, no, you're not basically good.
Yeah.
And you hear
they're
this all
going
the
after
time.
that from every angle. From every angle, they're like, and in case you thought it was this, no, it's not that either. We really are saying you're corrupted.
Yeah. And then you'll see some things that are condemned, or my translation says avoided, but whatever. They're condemning Pelagian errors and Manichaean errors. For readers or watchers or viewers, whatever we call them, that are not sort of tuned into that, it's helpful to. It's certainly helpful to know what Pelagianism is, right? Pelagianism, it's sometimes also called just the Pelagian heresy. It's a Christian position. It was a Christian position that was held by a man named Pelagius that was condemned.
The reason it's they should know about it is because it's the de facto position when you, I mean, honestly, in certainly Western Christianity, it's
correct.
What a ton of people believe. It's
at least in the semi-Pelagian form. Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
Yeah. But strict Pelagianism, like the full tilt Pelagianism, teaches that original sin does not taint the human nature or the will of a person at all.
Right.
So you brought up concupiscence. A Pelagian would say you are not your desire is not inclined to sin. When you hear the word will, we think of it merely as choice, because that's how we use it. I want, I will. But as they're using it, it's desire. Mm-hmm. It's your desire. It's a motivational desire, that thing that motivates what you want to do. The Pelagian would say that's not corrupted by original sin. And so the formula is like, yeah, it is. The scriptures speak differently here. Manichaeism is a little weirder. The reason it's brought up here is because it was making a bit of a resurgence in their time in these circles. You don't get a lot of that now. You might more and more now. I'd be willing to be shown to be wrong and saying we don't get a lot of that now if somebody out there wants to correct me. But basically, Manichaeism is a form of dualistic determinism.
Right.
Sort of think of it this way. And actually, as I speak, I think a lot of people think this way about God and the devil, as though they're two equal powers, right? Good and evil, light and darkness, that have an equal amount of power, who are sort of at war. And there's a sort of determinism that comes in sort of where you fall in that. It would say, Manichaeism would say, and the formula says here, that since the fall, human nature is created perfect. Okay, that's the one side. After Satan infuses original sin in man's nature, a poison is blended in the water. The basics here that they're getting after is this is just not strong enough. In both of these, in the Pelagian sense and in the Manichaean sense, this is just not strong enough. Now, when Melanchthon uses this word against Luther, he's talking about the deterministic aspects of Manichaeism, which is a little bit different than here. So,
yeah, and what's interesting is that they move from this to the article on free will, right? So,
right, correct.
So you have Pelagianism, and then they're going to move into free will, which these things are obviously connected.
Correct. Absolutely. You get one more bit of philosophical language before we close out, and I really like this. I love it when the formula cites other confessional documents. It just gives them, it just lends even more sort of authority to their acceptance, right? Mm-hmm. It'll say, it refers to Smalcald articles here, Luther's last confession that he wrote. as a deep corruption of our nature. There's that phrase again, right? This is where they get that. And then they're going to say, and we talked about this in one of the previous videos, the original sin is an accident. Now, that's Aristotelian. Don't think of this, like we said, though, as like something attached to you that you can easily brush off. All that they're intending to say here is that it's a derivation of it's a corruption, right? It's corruption, but that corruption is not part of what God intended when he created you.
Right. Awesome. Well, next video we'll get into free will. Which, if you're someone that plans on watching all these, I think what might be a good idea is, now that we're going through these articles, maybe pull up the article number 2 on free will, so you can go to bookofconcord.org, and it's free, and you can just click on the
That's
epitome.
A great site.
Yeah,
that's a great site.
Yeah, just
got
click on
everything
the
there.
Yep, just click on the epitome, scroll down. Maybe before you watch the next video, you can read the article on free will, which is the second article, which we'll be going over in the next video.
Great.